In this episode, we start with a reality that surprises many new learners. Some of the biggest risks to an organization do not begin inside the organization at all. They begin with outside companies that provide software, cloud hosting, payment processing, payroll, legal services, logistics, customer support, data storage, and countless other business functions. The moment a company depends on an external party, it also inherits part of that party's weaknesses, mistakes, limitations, and exposures. That is why managing and monitoring third-party risks matters so much in certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, CRISC, thinking. You are not just protecting your own systems and processes. You are also trying to understand how vendors, suppliers, contractors, consultants, and service providers could affect confidentiality, integrity, availability, compliance, operations, and reputation. For a beginner, the easiest way to understand this topic is to picture a business as a network of relationships rather than a single building with a locked door. Every connection creates value, but every connection also creates risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A third party is any outside organization or individual that provides a product, service, or business capability to your organization. That sounds simple, but the important lesson is that not all third parties matter in the same way. A company that delivers office snacks does not create the same level of cybersecurity and operational exposure as a cloud provider that stores customer records or a contractor that has remote administrative access. Risk management begins by recognizing those differences instead of treating every outside relationship as identical. Third-party risk management, TPRM, is the broader discipline of identifying, assessing, controlling, monitoring, and responding to the risks that come from those relationships over time. The word over time is important because this is never a one-time approval exercise. A vendor that looked safe 6 months ago may change ownership, experience a breach, weaken its controls, outsource critical work, or expand access in ways that alter the risk picture. Good monitoring keeps the organization aware of that moving reality. One common beginner misconception is that third-party risk is only a cybersecurity problem. In practice, it is much broader than that. A third party can create privacy risk by mishandling personal data, compliance risk by violating legal requirements, operational risk by failing to deliver services on time, financial risk by becoming unstable, strategic risk by preventing the organization from reaching business goals, and reputational risk by embarrassing the organization in public. Cybersecurity is one major part of the picture, but it is only one part. Imagine a payroll provider that never suffers a cyber attack, but repeatedly misses payroll deadlines because of poor internal controls and weak staffing. That is still a major risk because employees may lose trust, regulators may become interested, and operations may be disrupted. Managing third-party risk means asking a broad question. If this outside party fails, changes, or behaves poorly, how does that affect the organization? That wider view helps beginners think like risk professionals instead of thinking only like technology operators. The reason third-party risk has become more important is that modern organizations rely on complex supply chains and specialized service providers. Very few companies build and run everything themselves anymore. They purchase cloud infrastructure, software platforms, manage security services, customer communications tools, analytics services, identity solutions, legal platforms, and outsource support functions because outsourcing can reduce cost, increase speed, and provide expertise. Those benefits are real, but they also create dependence. Dependence is where risk enters the picture. When a business function depends on an outside provider, the organization gives up some direct control while still keeping full responsibility for the outcome. Customers, regulators, executives, and boards usually do not excuse a failure just because an external partner caused it. If customer data is exposed by a vendor, the organization still owns the damage in the eyes of the public. That is why a mature risk approach never says the vendor handles security, so we are covered. Responsibility can be shared in operations, but accountability usually stays close to home. A useful way to understand third-party risk is to follow the life of a vendor relationship from beginning to end. The risk story begins before a contract is signed, when the organization decides whether it should use the third party at all. It continues during selection, when the organization evaluates the provider's capabilities, controls, financial health, and history. It grows during onboarding, when access is granted, data is shared, and processes are connected. It remains active during ongoing service delivery, when performance, control effectiveness, and compliance need to be watched. Finally, it continues through offboarding, when access is removed, data is returned or destroyed, and dependency is reduced. Beginners often focus only on the selection phase because it feels like the obvious place to review risk, but that is only the start. A weak exit process can create lingering accounts, unreturned data, forgotten integrations, and unclear responsibilities. The full life cycle matters because risk changes as the relationship matures, expands, or winds down. Before an organization can manage third-party risk well, it usually needs to classify third parties based on criticality and inherent risk. Criticality refers to how important the third party is to business operations, while inherent risk refers to the level of risk present before additional controls are considered. A provider that stores sensitive customer data, supports a mission-critical process, or has privileged access to internal systems would usually be considered both more critical and more risky than a provider with no system access and minimal business impact. This classification helps the organization decide where to spend time and effort. Without it, teams may waste energy reviewing low-impact vendors while missing the ones that truly matter. For beginners, a helpful mental model is to sort third parties by what they touch, how much access they have, what type of data they handle, and what happens if they fail. Those simple questions quickly reveal which relationships deserve deeper scrutiny, more formal oversight, stronger contract terms, and more frequent monitoring. Risk management becomes much more practical when attention follows impact. Due diligence is the process of learning enough about a third party before approval to make an informed decision. This does not mean chasing perfection or demanding endless paperwork from every vendor. It means gathering evidence that is appropriate to the importance and risk of the relationship. Organizations may review financial stability, legal and regulatory issues, control maturity, breach history, incident response capability, data handling practices, resilience planning, subcontractor use, and governance structure. They also want to understand whether the vendor can truly perform the service it promises. A beginner should notice that good due diligence combines security thinking with business thinking. A provider may have strong technical controls and still be a poor choice if it lacks operational discipline or financial strength. The goal is not just to ask whether the vendor has security. The goal is to ask whether the vendor can be trusted to support the organization safely, reliably, and consistently. That distinction is central to real-world third-party risk analysis. Contracts play a major role because they turn expectations into enforceable obligations. Many people think of contracts as legal paperwork that lives in a drawer, but from a risk perspective, the contract is one of the most important control tools in the relationship. It can define security expectations, privacy requirements, audit rights, breach notification timing, service availability commitments, data ownership, retention and destruction obligations, subcontractor restrictions, reporting requirements, insurance expectations, and termination rights. A service level agreement, SLA, often appears within or alongside the contract and focuses on measurable performance commitments such as uptime, response time, and support obligations. These terms matter because vague expectations are difficult to monitor and even harder to enforce. If the organization never required timely incident notification, it will struggle later when a vendor delays disclosure. If access control standards were never defined, weak practices may go unchallenged. Strong contracts do not eliminate risk, but they create clarity, accountability, and leverage when things begin to go wrong. After a third party is approved and on board, monitoring becomes the real test of maturity. Many organizations are reasonably good at initial reviews and much weaker at ongoing oversight. They collect questionnaires, hold meetings, sign contracts, and then assume the risk has been handled. In reality, The most important question is whether the third party continues to meet expectations as the relationship evolves. Ongoing monitoring may involve reviewing performance against service commitments, reassessing risk periodically, watching for security incidents, tracking regulatory changes, reviewing independent assurance reports, confirming access remains appropriate, and identifying changes in ownership or business model. The frequency and depth of monitoring should depend on the risk level of the relationship. High-risk vendors deserve more frequent attention than low-risk vendors. A beginner should see monitoring as a way of staying alert to drift. Over time, environments change, teams change, technologies change, and even well-managed vendors can become riskier than they once were. Monitoring is how organizations notice that change before it becomes a major event. A practical challenge in third-party risk is understanding concentration risk and fourth-party risk. Concentration risk happens when the organization depends too heavily on one provider or on several providers with the same hidden dependency. If multiple critical services all rely on the same cloud platform, network carrier, or software component, a single failure can spread farther than expected. Fourth-party risk appears when your third party relies on its own vendors and subcontractors to deliver the service. Even if your direct provider seems strong, its unseen dependencies may introduce new exposures. Beginners sometimes assume risk stops at the signed contract, but the chain often goes deeper. For example, a managed service provider may depend on a separate identity platform, a data center operator, and external support contractors across different regions. If those downstream relationships are weak, your organization may still suffer the consequences. This does not mean every dependency must be traced to the edge of the earth. It means mature oversight asks how services are actually delivered and where hidden dependencies could affect resilience, security, and compliance. Another major lesson is that third-party risk ownership is shared across the organization, not confined to one risk team. Procurement may help with onboarding and contract flow. Legal may shape contract language and obligations. Information security may review control maturity and access concerns. Privacy teams may evaluate data use and retention. Business owners understand operational dependence and service outcomes. Compliance teams may interpret regulatory expectations. Internal audit may provide assurance about whether the overall process is working. Senior leadership may set risk appetite and approve exceptions. When roles are unclear, important issues fall between teams. A business unit may rush a vendor into production without security review, or the security team may identify concerns but lack authority to influence contract terms. A well-run program defines who initiates reviews, who performs assessments, who approves exceptions, who monitors performance, and who acts when risk becomes unacceptable. For beginners, this is a reminder that risk management is as much about governance and coordination as it is about technical control evaluation. No monitoring program is complete without a way to handle issues, escalating concerns, and changing risk conditions. Sometimes monitoring reveals a service failure, a late report, a control weakness, a policy gap, or a serious incident. The organization then needs a structured way to record the issue, assign ownership, track remediation, verify completion, and decide whether the residual risk is acceptable in the meantime. Without that discipline, known problems simply become background noise. A vendor might repeatedly miss deadlines for correcting weaknesses, while the business keeps renewing the contract because the service is convenient. Good issue management forces the organization to decide whether to accept the risk temporarily, impose compensating controls, demand faster remediation, reduce reliance, or terminate the relationship. Beginners should understand that risk monitoring is not passive observation. It must lead to decisions and action. A report that identifies serious vendor weaknesses but triggers no response is not evidence of control. It is evidence that the organization noticed the danger and then chose not to move. A simple example helps tie the ideas together. Imagine a hospital uses an outside company to host an appointment scheduling platform. That provider stores patient information, supports critical daily operations, and connects to internal systems. Before approval, the hospital should assess the provider's control maturity, resilience, privacy practices, and history. In the contract, it should define notification obligations, availability expectations, data protection requirements, and rights to review evidence. After onboarding, it should monitor uptime, incidents, access changes, audit results, and major business changes at the provider. It should also ask whether the provider relies on other parties for storage, identity, or customer support. Now imagine the provider announces it was acquired by another company and will move data processing to a different region. That is not a trivial business update. It changes legal exposure, operational dependencies, and possibly privacy obligations. Effective monitoring exists so the organization can recognize that the risk profile has changed and respond before the change causes real harm. For exam thinking and for real life, it helps to remember that managing third-party risk is not about eliminating all outside relationships. Organizations work with third parties because doing so often makes excellent business sense. The goal is to make those relationships visible, understandable, controlled, and reviewable. That means knowing which vendors matter most, understanding the services they provide, defining expectations clearly, assessing their risk intelligently, monitoring them consistently, and responding when evidence shows the relationship is drifting outside acceptable boundaries. It also means recognizing that trust should be informed by evidence rather than convenience, optimism, or brand reputation. A well-known vendor can still suffer major failures, and a smaller provider can be highly disciplined and dependable. Strong risk practice looks past assumptions and asks grounded questions about impact, exposure, accountability, and resilience. When beginners grasp that principle, the topic becomes much less mysterious. Third-party risk is really the art of managing dependence without surrendering awareness. As we close, the main idea to carry forward is that every external relationship extends the organization's risk landscape, sometimes quietly and sometimes dramatically. Managing and monitoring third-party risks means treating vendors and service providers as part of the broader operating environment rather than as separate actors whose problems do not belong to you. The strongest approach begins before the contract, follows the relationship through its full life cycle, and keeps watching as conditions change. It balances business value with caution, legal obligations with operational reality, and trust with verification. For a new learner, that is the heart of this subject. When an organization depends on others, it must understand that dependence well enough to govern it. CRISC expects you to think beyond internal systems and recognize how outside parties can shape business outcomes, security posture, resilience, and compliance. Once you see those connections clearly, third-party risk stops looking like a side topic and starts looking like a central part of modern risk management.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.